Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on the Church of Jesus Christ Forever, also known as Perfect Church. In part 1, Jesse described his difficult childhood growing up in a church that skewed scripture and abused its congregants. Now in part 2, Jesse explores his multiple attempts to escape this life, taking drastic measures to break free. Part 3 will look at Jesse's rebirth and ultimate escape from the group, creating a beautiful life for himself in adulthood. If you would like to listen to this episode or any future episodes in full, ad-free with early access, you can sign up to patreon.com/The Cult Vault to support the show from as little as £1 a month. Some wording in this episode has been muted due to its derogatory nature, and please note that there is a trigger warning of potentially offensive language and child abuse. And now, here is Jesse.
I was actually crying at the email that you sent that included a lot of the information around your experiences, some of which you've just told us there. And I was absolutely disgusted at some of the things that you were subjected to by a group of people that claim to be perfect individuals. And the fact that your parents left you in this environment, did they know what was happening?
So my parents were sort of aware. Anything that happened, they had to go along with it. I mean, my parents were victims as well, to a degree. If they didn't allow whatever happened to happen, then they would have been subject of some level of restriction by the pastor, or not allowed to attend church or attend church events. So my parents were aware of some of it, but, in speaking with my mom after I left and just making her aware of different things that had happened, she was not aware of them. She still refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing on the part of the church, but she was not aware of certain things happening. When I was placed at someone's house, they were given full rights to do whatever they wanted to me. And I don't know that my parents were informed of every single thing that happened. And there was a lot that happened. A lot of the abuse that happened was behind closed doors. There were just a few people there, and those were all very, very loyal members of the church. So the pastor was pretty smart about that, in making sure that the only people that saw were people who wouldn't actually go to the police about it. So unfortunately, all of those people that saw the abuse happen are still in the church. And there's no way that, what am I going to do? It's my word against 10 people who are just loyal church followers.
Were you separated from your siblings at this point? Where were they placed, and how long did your parents go to Hawaii for? And are you aware of why they went over to the islands?
My mom is still on very good terms with members of the pastor's family in Hawaii from when, she was stationed there as a stewardess. So she's kept up a relationship with them. And so my parents, actually Hawaii was a big part of our lives when I was growing up. We were told that, God would send us out into the world, and Hawaii was going to be my family's location if we could, ever get our act together. So my parents would visit often. And as a 13-year-old, when I was 13, my parents would visit. My siblings were all placed at different homes. And my parents only went for about 2 weeks. So those 2 weeks passed, and I was still at this family's house. And I was told by the pastor came over one night and told me that I was never going to go home until I changed. So I was at this family's house for 3-4 months, maybe. My parents and all my siblings were back at home while I was still at this family's house.
Because you would eat some chocolate and take a blanket.
I would cheat on my fasts. I would just speak without thinking. Which led to the punishments, and it was really just setting me up for failure. If I was monitored at all times of the day, I do not do well under pressure. And so I would just make mistake upon mistake, which would just infuriate them. There's no way that I could be successful.
Have you and your siblings had a chance to talk about what happened with them in the homes that they were placed in at this time where you're separated?
We haven't had a conversation about it, but to my knowledge, their environment was fine. They never underwent any extreme abuse, just kind of the normal abuse.
So the pastor's aware of your circumstances at this point, of what the family has tried to do to break you into submission, and he's decided at this point that you're not going to be reunited with your family. You're going to be moved to another home. So what happens after you leave this big house with this first family?
I actually stayed at that house.
Right.
Yeah.
So when they threatened to take you somewhere where you'd never see your parents again, this is another tactic, and then they take you to see your parents so that you can say goodbye.
Yes. So when they decided, like, Jesse's not going to be at our house anymore, like, we're done with Jesse, but however, you're going to go say goodbye to your parents. At that point, I knew that I was going home for good. At that point, I knew none of their tactics were working. So really, I won. I wasn't intentional. I wasn't trying to be rebellious as a 13-year-old boy, but if we want to look at the larger picture, they weren't successful in changing me to, how they want. And so I was placed back in my home.
What was that like for you, that reintegration into your family's life?
Initially, it was abusive. I was forced to sleep in the basement in a room. I remember that my hands, because every time I was in trouble at this big house, I would fidget, and my hands were bloody. It was winter, my hands were drier, and my hands were just bloody. So for the first few weeks, I actually slept with sandwich bags over my hands with hand lotion, just to be able to restore my hands, because they were just caked in blood. And my life at this, back at my house was, I guess, just normally abusive. There were a lot of visits from members of the church, questioning how I was doing. And that's about what I remember. I don't remember much after that. I knew that I was in trouble for the next several years. There's probably 1 year where, I don't know, amazingly, I didn't do anything wrong. So, and I was great.
But this continuous monitoring of your behavior, it's not something that ends once you leave this house and return home. It's something that's continuous throughout your time within the church. It feels like severe, like, negative nepotism. Is this like a punishment for your mum, like, through you? I don't understand.
I mean, no one in the church is ever going to admit that this is because of my mom. Our family is treated differently. There's no way that we're that terrible of a family, so I will say then, absolutely, yes, it is because of my mom being married to the pastor. For me specifically, well, first of all, we were never allowed relationships. I mean, we never took sex ed classes. We were always had to sit in the halls in school when these classes took place. We knew nothing. And I was a 13-year-old boy going through puberty and told, don't touch the candy. So when I'd be, I would ask people questions, or I discovered the internet like every other teenage boy in the world. And I was caught because I wasn't very sneaky, and I wasn't a very good liar. So, this was my problem. It was, I was going through puberty, and they tried to stifle that as much as possible. And so I would get in trouble. I mean, just all through my teenage years. There was not really a moment, except for 1 year, I believe, that I was that I could do anything right. Yeah, and the punishments just got worse.
Do you know of any other children that were subjected to similar treatment? You mentioned there's a group of you that have filed police reports. So has there been a chance for you to sit down with others and realize that there was other abuse taking place?
So I know that there was other abuse. I'd hear about it from other former members. No one was ever treated the same way I was treated. I was the worst in the church, and you know, I've never been first in anything, but I certainly took first place at being last place in the church, and I'm very happy with that. I am very happy. No one was ever treated quite as poorly as I was, or abusively as I was in the church, because I could never really get it together. And I know specifically of other abuse. There was one girl who, surprisingly, she's still in the church. There's one girl who was caught with a romance novel. And I remember hearing about it, and I remember knowing that her punishment was going to be very, very severe. Like, that was not allowed at all.
So you mentioned that this started with this family really kind of upping the severity of punishment around the age of 13, but continued. Can you paint the picture of what that was like from sort of 13 onwards and until the point where you become independent enough to make your own decisions?
My teenage years were very rocky. I could never really quite get it together in the church, and so I was constantly in trouble, along with a few of my other siblings. And at the age of probably 16, maybe early 17, I started having real doubts about the church. And I was very scared, actually. I was taught to never question anything. I was taught that the pastor was the voice of God, and if we ever come against him, we're going to be struck down. So the first time I ever told him he was wrong, I was deathly afraid. And when I was 17, I was working for this construction company within the church. And it was every day, getting up super early, 5 a.m., and then sitting for about an hour in a car ride to the construction site. And I would fall asleep naturally. But I was on this car ride, I was told, like, wake up, Jesse, wake up, and I was forced to read the Bible on the way at 5 a.m. on the way to the construction site, where I would then work for about 12 hours and just kind of be harassed by the construction leaders and all the people working with us, who were all members of the church. It was just a constant question of, like, Jesse, why do you look at the internet? Why are you on the internet? Jesse, why are you cheating on your fasts? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? So it's just 12 hours every single day of answering questions, of being interrogated, of feeling harassed, of being demoralized, and it was horrible. Plus, in addition to that, it's just hard labor, and I wasn't being paid for it. They refused to pay me. And finally, when there was a moment, I believe at one point I was briefly paid, and my mom was in charge of, responsible for holding that money. I was never given access to that money. So I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't do it. And I remember deciding I need to leave the church, but I didn't have any resources, because the church would deliberately keep the contact information from anyone, who had left the church. There was no way I could get in contact with them. And didn't have a cell phone, didn't have email. I had no access to the outside world. And I was constantly monitored. There was a very, very, very rare moment when I was ever left alone. So I decided I needed to leave. And I gained access to my funds. And one morning I called a taxi, and I drove, and I got a taxi to the next town over, to Rockford, Illinois, where I booked a flight. And I didn't know where I was. I knew that the airport had just opened up, and so they were offering one flight a day to about 4 locations. I didn't know I was going that morning. I knew I needed to leave. I knew I needed to get to the airport, and I was hoping that there was a flight that day. And I found out that it was a flight to Florida. I said, all right, well, that's where I'm going.
Oh my goodness.
So I went to Florida as a 17-year-old, where I kind of survived through a hurricane. I had a hotel room. I had enough money for one night in a hotel room. But then the hurricane struck, and this was in 2004. So I don't remember what hurricane it was. And the hotel couldn't kick me out. Well, the hurricane passed, they finally kicked me out, and I had nowhere to go. And so I would sneak into rooms that were abandoned in this hotel, kind of a cheap motel. And I kind of made it through my time in Florida by working. I was only there for a few weeks, about maybe 3 weeks, where I eventually I ran out of money, and I realized like maybe I should head home because I have no resources. So I had a job, and I was paid for one day where it was just enough to get me from Florida up to St. Louis. So I took a bus up to St. Louis, where I then, as a 17-year-old, stayed in homeless shelters. And coming from a very small town in Illinois, it was all white, and not really knowing much about the world. St. Louis was a really big city where there was diversity, and I knew nothing about the world. I mean, I was scared. I had no idea what I was doing. I was staying in homeless shelters. I was exposed for the first time to mental illness. And I just shocking, and I was terrified. So I ended up panhandling my way up to Chicago from there, where I stayed in some of the largest homeless shelters in the city. And every day I went out and I was panhandling money, just asking for money, just to make it another day, until I realized, and I actually turned 18 in Chicago, homeless. And I remember going out to the Navy Pier, and this was my birthday present to myself, is to walk to the end of the pier and just look out over the water. That's how I turned 18. And then I realized that I was going to be every day out, asking for money, until I was able to get enough money to get back to my hometown and just deal with the church. So I did. I panhandled enough to get home, to get back to Rockford, Illinois, where I called my mom on a payphone and said, "I'm coming home. Can you pick me up?" And she called me back on the payphone and told me, "No, you have to get home on your own. So make your way down here." So when I made my way back to Oregon, Illinois, we went over to my half sister's house, that is the daughter of the pastor, where they put me through an interrogation. They grabbed my backpack, emptied everything out. I was slapped in the face a couple times. And then I was told that if I wanted to come back to the church, it was on their terms. So they sent me home, shaved the center of my head like a reverse mohawk, forced me, and it was November maybe, forced me to sleep in our unheated garage in a tent. Sorry, I apologize. I slept in the backyard in a tent with no heater. And once it got cold enough, they moved me into the garage, and we're also no heater. And I finally put a heater in, and the pastor came over and said that I was too comfortable, and they took away the heater. I was forced to defecate in a bucket. I wasn't I wasn't allowed to use the bathroom in the house. And I couldn't step foot in the house. I was forced to take my meals on the front porch. And I don't remember how long I was there, but I was finally allowed back in the house, and that was late 2004. And then 2005 came around, and the church decided that they were going to move. They were going to sort of do a migration to the Hawaiian Islands. They believed that God had showed them that was the promised land. And I mean, coming from Illinois, I sort of get that Hawaii is the promised land. Why wouldn't it be, right? Of course, God's going to show me that beautiful tropical islands are where you want me.
Yeah, and it's the same for a lot of groups as well. Hawaii, I don't know, it seems to be a hot spot for strange groups and gatherings.
Yep. So they sent people over to Hawaii, and then they sent they sent people over, and then I was not allowed to go, and then my family was going to visit a couple months later, and my family was called in for a meeting with the pastor, and it was my mom, my dad, my younger sister, my younger brother, and myself, and I was told that I wasn't going to be able to go on the family vacation. The pastor stated that I was going to stay back in Illinois while my family went on this vacation to Hawaii. However, because I'd been so rebellious in the church, I couldn't stay home by myself. I was 18 at the time. So, and this actually was my senior year of high school, but I wasn't attending school. So while we'll get to that. So this, so the church didn't know where to put me while my family went to Hawaii. So they decided to put me in Michigan, the state of Michigan, with another church family. They were living up there because of a job. So I went to Michigan, and it was fine initially. And then the punishment started happening, and I became very vulnerable. It was a moment where the wife, Brenda, asked me if I wanted dessert, and I was not allowed desserts. She asked me if I wanted dessert, and I said yes, very excitedly. So we went over to the refrigerator, and she pulled out a sandwich bag full of dog feces and lifted my shirt and wiped it all over my chest, over my bare chest, and laughed at me and told me that my life was shit, that this was a representation of what my life was. I remember being so humiliated and just in shock that I had dog feces spread over my chest, like my bare chest. And here's this woman laughing at me. And I mean, I was just sobbing. And I remember in the shower, she told me to go take a shower. I remember standing in the shower and just trying not to touch it, like clean it off without touching my chest, and realizing that I was being put in the same position as I was when I was 13.
What is wrong with these people? What is wrong with these people?
They believe that they can do whatever they want. They believe that they are the called people of God. And
it's like they're all cut from the same cloth. How is it possible that all these people have found one another?
It's scary. Yeah. After that night, I decided that I needed to leave the church. This was gone too far. And so I was never left by myself. But one day, the husband was at work, the wife decided to go run some errands, and I was left alone. And I made my move. I went to the parents' bedrooms. I took some money from their a bunch of change, from their dresser. Took some things I thought that I could sell. So like I took a camera. I took some food that I could eat. And I called a taxi, and I actually paid the taxi with the change. We went to the bus station, and I bought a ticket to California. And I figured if I could survive in Chicago being homeless, I can do it in California. I don't know anyone in California. I knew nobody, but I'm going to get out there and start over. I got to get away from these people. Well, a few hours passed while I was waiting for the bus in the bus station, and in walks Brenda, the mom from this house. And I kind of just backed out. She says, "Come with me," and I backed down. We get in the car, and we get the pastor on the phone. The pastor says, "Hey, things are going to be better, and they're going to be great." And I say, "Okay, great." So we get back to the house, and they empty my backpack, and they photograph everything that I've taken, all the money and all the things, and they make me sign a document that says, I, Jesse Morris, admit that I stole all these items. And then they tell me that next time I try to leave the church, they're going to turn these into the police. So if I ever wanted to leave the church again, I can't go to the police. Additionally, they took my license. So I had no form of identification. I didn't have a cell phone. I didn't have access to a computer. I didn't have contact information for any of my family members. Couldn't really go home to Illinois because my parents are still in the church. And so my resources were very, very limited. I didn't know, as an 18-year-old who's still very much, green and wet behind the ears, not really knowing that much. I didn't know the resource, the things I know now. But what I did know was that I was being blackmailed and that I needed to leave the church. And so I did what I did to survive. I started sneaking out in the middle of the night, and I needed money. Money was going to get me a bus ticket. Money was going to get me somewhere else. And I snuck out in the middle of the night over a span of several weeks, and I started looking in cars for money. And I never broke anything. I had a flashlight, and if the door was unlocked, I'd get in the car and I'd take money out, and I would save it outside of the house because they would search my room. So I'd save it. I'd put it under some bushes at a neighbor's house. And then one day I walked by a school, and I was like, well, the school has machines, and so maybe I can somehow like get into a machine or in the office. And so I found a window was unlocked, and I went in the school, and I was able to acquire some money, and then I made just a bigger mistake, and that was to realize that people feel more secure in their. I'm not going to go through all that through all the details because I don't want to give anyone ideas. However, I went into people's garages where their cars were, and I found more items, and then I went into a house. And I stole money, and I did what I did to survive. My life was being threatened. I was being blackmailed. I had no resources, and I needed to leave. And so I saved. And then one night I was being babysat. The husband and wife went on a date, so I was being babysat as an 18-year-old by someone else. And when the parents came home, the wife pulled me aside. She accused me of doing of some wrongdoing, and I stated like I didn't do anything wrong. And she said, no, God showed me. I'm like, well, that's not true. Like, I didn't do anything wrong. So I was very adamant about not committing any sin. And so they were also equally adamant that I was guilty. And so they put me through hell that night. The husband brought me into the bathroom and with a butcher knife and some Tabasco sauce, and stated that because I was sinning, God was going to punish me. And he said, Tabasco sauce burns, so I'm going to put some on your body, or I'm going to dismember you. And he held a knife up. And so I was like, well, you can't put your hands on me. You're not my dad. You can't do anything. I'm innocent. I didn't do anything wrong. And here's a knife and a bottle of Tabasco sauce.
Oh my goodness. How did he go from I'm going to irritate your skin with hot sauce to I'm going to cut you into pieces? Oh my goodness. What is wrong with these people?
I didn't know until years later that when they were accusing me of these things, this husband got on the phone with, and Bob got on the phone with Kali, the pastor, and said, this is what's going on. And Kali told Bob to take me into the bathroom and scare me. So Kali is the one that gave Bob this direction. Bob could have very well said no as an adult who is there to care for me, but he didn't. So Bob, as soon as I told Bob that you're not my dad, you can't touch me, you can't put your hands on me, Bob smashed the bottle, threw me up against the wall, asked me if I wanted to fight, and I said no. So we went out, we left the bathroom intact and got on the phone with the pastor, and this was the first moment I ever told the pastor he was wrong. I was just scared. I knew that, I believed that the pastor, was the voice of God, and that for me to come against him was terrifying. And I did, but however, they had told me that God showed them that I did this wrong. And in that moment I knew, okay, maybe God shows you guys something, but you can't state that God showed you this when I didn't do it, which means that you guys are wrong. And I said that.
They haven't said, God showed us you've been stealing out of people's houses, which is illegal, which is wrong, which is something that you have been doing. They're accusing you of something that they claim God has shown them you doing, which you have not been doing.
Correct. And so they said, well, we know you're going to leave the church anyway, so whatever. So, and actually that night there wasn't really a punishment, which is very weird, because usually there's there's a punishment. But I went to bed that night. I slept in the bed in the room that I was sleeping in, and it was kind of normal. But this was a major turning point. The church had gone from all of these meetings as I was growing up, of like, Jesse, you're going to hell, Jesse, you're going to hell, to we're going to make Jesse sleep in his underwear in the cold, to removing me from my house and putting me in other people's homes, to now threatening to dismember me. Everything was becoming more and more extreme. What happens if God told them to kill me? That's the only, you tell me I'm going to hell, you're telling me you're going to cut off a piece of my body. What's the next thing that's going to happen? And so I didn't know that they were just trying to scare me. I believed it. Everything that they said that they were going to do, they carried out. So how was I to know that they were not going to cut off a piece of my body?
Yeah. Well, it's escalating. Where does it stop?
Right. So at that moment, I got to get out. I need to leave. Like, I have to go. So I couldn't leave that night because they were still very suspicious of me. So the next night I gathered all my things and I snuck out in the middle of the night, grabbed all the money that I had saved up. And I distinctly remember thinking that if I'm caught, prison's going to be better. Like I was looking forward to it. I was looking forward to being out of the church. And if I was caught, then so be it. Because anything at this point was going to be better. I had to leave. So that night I decided, there wasn't any more playing. There wasn't any more like just kind of biding my time. So I stole a car. My intent was to get down to Illinois, find my family members who had left the church. I knew the town they were in, and I sort of knew this section of town. It's Rockford. It's a big city. But I knew nothing else. All I knew was that they're going to kill me next. That was the next thing. The church is going to kill me. I don't have any resources up in Michigan. I got to get out. And so I stole a car. And the police caught me. And when they caught me, all of the cultish tricks of the trade kind of kicked in. Like the police caught me, which tells me that I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, the church is right. That's what went through my head in that split second because of how I was brainwashed. There's always a right and a wrong. And if I'm wrong, someone's got to be right. And that means the church. And that means that everything that the church had done somehow was justified. That's what I believed in the moment. Everything that I had done was wrong, and the church was justified in everything that they did because I had been caught by the police. And in that moment, I knew that I had to admit everything. So I admitted everything to the police right there on the spot. And they took me to the jail, where I spent 3 days. They took me to the county jail, where I spent 3 months. And the church uses this as like, see, Jesse, we were right. It's 3. 3 means complete, which means God's showing us that you're wrong, Jesse. So, and then I went to prison, and I spent 3 years in prison.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And I never admitted to the police what happened. There was a moment, actually, the very first day when I was arrested, I said I was being abused by the husband, by Bob. And then I changed that story because I was afraid of like God coming down on me or, being judged or whatever. And so I changed my story and I said I was just being stupid. I think I probably used something like that as an 18-year-old, like I was just making, stupid decisions. So I never actually really disclosed anything about the church to any official. So I went to prison for 3 years, where it was really bad. I mean, there were multiple times I was almost raped. I'm a clean-shaven white kid, People like me don't make it in prison. And so luckily I was at lower security prisons because nothing I did was violent. And I was obviously well behaved in prison. It's not like I was I don't know. It's not like I was a terrible person. You know, I had very good behavior in prison. 2 weeks before I got out, so actually, it took my parents 13 months to visit me. July 29th, 2006 was when my parents first visited me in prison. And we spent, I think, 12 hours talking. And I remember how when my parents were visiting me, I could be myself. I could kind of let down my guard. And as soon as my parents left and turned the corner, I sort of kind of slouched down in my seat and assumed kind of like a harder stance of, this is how I need to act in prison. And I hated it.
Yeah, I've worked with a group of male prisoners in Liverpool, and that's exactly what some of them have told me about their experience of being inside the prison. It's exhausting because every time they're out of their cell, they have to become a certain type of person or role play a certain type of person, and it's only when their cell doors are finally closed for the night that they can actually relax and put, as you said, let that guard down. So I've heard firsthand that is absolutely how a lot of people feel they have to be inside prison.
Yeah, it was exhausting, and it was scary, and it was it's just so sad that my parents are gone, and here I was, you know, alone again, and someone who I didn't want to be. And I couldn't tell anyone about it. Couldn't tell anyone why I was actually in prison. I near the end of my 3 years, and I had actually spent the 3 years communicating with the church, and because I was trying to, you know, get on the good side again. I had been so brainwashed that I believed, like, this is who I need to be with again. And I was on pretty good terms with him towards the end of my sentence. And then I got a phone call one day. Well, I actually was on the yard, and I was told, you know, like, Morris, report to your housing unit, go see your counselor. So I went, and I thought it was something to do with the parole that I was going to get. So I went in, and the counselor said, hey, I need you to call your mom. I'm like, well, what do you mean call my mom on this phone? She said, yes. And I knew that something had happened, because under no circumstances do you use the counselor's phone. There are,
right,
you know, there are little phones out in the day rooms they use. So I knew something had happened. So I called my mom, and she said, Jesse, I just need you to be strong. A few hours ago, Dad died. And I just put my head down and cried, and just the worst news that I could have ever had. I mean, I was sitting in prison. How proud of me could my dad have been, you know? Yeah, he was in the church, and he believed a certain thing, but I mean, in that moment, I wanted nothing more than my dad to be proud, and I could never get that back. I never would have that chance, you know, outside of prison, to take a walk with my dad. And yeah, went back to my room. I was in a lower security prison, so there were rooms, and I just sobbed, and they had me on suicide. I mean, they have everyone on suicide watch, but I was put on suicide watch, and I tried calling the church. I was by myself, you know, dealing with the death of my dad. I didn't know what to do. So I called the church, and they initially said, like, pray, you can make it. You only have a few days left. And I just felt very overwhelmed. So I called them again, and they yelled at me, told me not to call them again. Said that, you've been told what to do. You know that you need to pray, and stop calling us. Yeah, that's how I dealt with the death of my dad. Didn't get to go to the funeral because it would have cost too much. I would have to pay for the guards, for two corrections officers to come with me, and the transportation, and overtime, and the food, and, you know, so I didn't go to my dad's funeral. So I got out a couple weeks later, and my mom picked me up, And we sat there and we kind of cried in the car a little bit. And then we headed down to Illinois, and where I believed after 3 years that the church was different. I'd never been away from the church like this. So we went back down to the church, and the first thing that the pastor did was have me stand up. So everyone kind of got together for a welcome home party or whatever. And the first thing that the pastor had me do was stand up and apologize to everyone. And I had spent 3 years apologizing it. And this is what I had to come home to. And then I knew that the church was no different, that nothing had changed.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series on the Church of Jesus Christ Forever, also known as Perfect Church. If you would like to listen to this episode or any future episodes in full, ad-free, with early access, you can sign up to patreon.com/thecultvault to support the show from as little as £1 a month. To get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.